Who are the gods of the pre-Christian Irish? Falche Mocharda Smishe Kevin Malkadier. This is the question that I get asked most often, I think, and rightly so, but it isn't necessarily one that's easy to answer, but it will be dealt with in brief here. It will be strictly from textual analysis. So we'll start by looking at the example given in the Historia Brittonum, the Irish translation of this work. This is one of our earliest sources that gives a complete sort of list of who they think are the chief gods or the chiefs of the Tuatha. And this is from about the 11th century, and so it predates the Laur Gavala by about 100 years or so. So the deities that they list, and they list them in a Latin sort of style, so it's a little bit strange, but so it says Luchta is the artifex, Credna the figurus, Dienkecht the medicus, Aidan his daughter, the nurse of the poets, Goivnen the faber or the builder, constructor, Lug son of Ethna, with whom were all the arts, Dagda the great, son of Eladon, son of Delva, the king, Ogma, brother of the king. It was with him came the letters of the Scots. Now this list of deities is more or less repeated in other places in various ways. So these deities, although many people don't reckon Credna and Luchta to be all that important, all of these deities listed play a significant role in the battle against the Fomorians. And this is exactly the point that the Historia Brittonum points out. It says it was these men that defeated in the great battle the mariners, i.e. the Fomorians, so that they fled from them into their tower, i.e. a very strong fortress on the sea. Now there were many other gods worshipped in Ireland and in other Celtic lands, but these were the primary deities, and they were identified as being sons of Ethlu. Now we see this list more or less repeated in another version of the Laur Gavala. It says, Bethach, son of Eardan, was chieftain of that taking, and of the arts. Now I suppose I should say that Bethach seems to mean being, life, existence, something of that sort. So, this is a fairly philosophical sort of concept being expressed here in the name. So he was the chieftain in the beginning, and that 7 chieftains followed him: Dagda, Dienketh, Credna, Luchna, Nuada, Lug, and Govnu, the 7 sons of Ethlu. Now, we notice here that Ogma is not included. Although it doesn't include Ogma, this is more or less a repeat of the list that we see in an earlier source. Now, interesting here to mention too is that Bethach is son of one called Eardan. Now, Dan here, Ir means after, and Dan likely means gift. And specifically, it's implying a divine gift from God to man. And in a Christian sense, it refers to a divine gift given to man by the Holy Ghost. So it is a word that has a lot of religious connotation. And remember, this is being written by people who are Christians. And so the words that they choose and the names that they choose to express them have some sort of meaning. And a lot of words that Irish Christianity used in the early formative years were words that were clearly borrowed and used in the same way as their pre-Christian speakers used them. And they were used in a religious context, such as cred, to believe, atach, to ask for refuge, seek refuge, or to pray, or to curse, which is also one of the mounts of the three kings. So really, when you're reading these names, you should be reading the meaning of the names, which is after gift, existence, and then which gives rise to the kings or the chieftains of the gods. Now, this isn't me reading anything into it. It's simply translating the names and reading what is actually there. So if you're looking for who is considered to be the high supreme gods, the sources tell you this. And further, they identify them as being the sons of Ethlu. Now, there is confusion, of course, because the stories introduce Ethlu as primarily being the mother of Lugh, and he is almost always identified as being her son. And of course, there's lots of folk tales about how he is conceived by her. But she is likewise the mother of all the main deities. It just so happens that Lugh seems to have a very special connection with her, probably due to, at the origin point of this, he was or is the sort of central figure that represents all of their skills and powers. Likewise, he is the Nia, the grandson, who is destined to overthrow his grandfather. And in ancient Irish kingship rights, it seems the most likely scenario, or the ideal scenario, was that the father did not directly pass the kingship onto his son, but it was taken over by the grandson. Anyway, we don't want to get into here, because it will take too long, into how this genealogy really works out, because really it doesn't work out, because the concept of the gods seems to have been very non-conducive to these kinds of stories. They're really fundamentally expressing a philosophical idea about how the world emerged, and it's maybe stories came after that. We see a similar thing with Zeus in Greek myth. So Zeus is the king of the gods, prophesied to overthrow his father, but he is the last-born, right? He's not the firstborn, he's the last-born. But he escapes his fate and later is able to rescue the other gods. And so the last-born becomes the firstborn, because in the process of rescuing the other gods from being consumed by Kronos, they are sort of reborn from him when he pukes them out. So Zeus goes from being the last-born to the firstborn, and therefore inherits the position of king. Now, who is considered to be supreme king in the Irish sources is not clear. In all the sources, it is clear that Nuada was the first king. He is generally or almost always replaced by Lugh at some point, and in some later sources, basically Nuada seems to disappear from the list, and instead there is a different list that shows Ogma, Dagda, and Lugh. This is the list reflected by the Historia Brittonum. That list did not include Nuada, but it included Ogma. So lists that include Ogma exclude Nuada, and lists that include Nuada exclude Ogma. This might be due to some sort of regional variation as to what gods they reckoned. It's hard to say, but you will either find the triad represented as Lugh, Dagda, and Nuada, where Lugh and Nuada seem to share the kingship, and the Dagda is a priest figure strictly, and not the king. Or you find it that the Dagda is represented as the king priest. Now, here comes the controversial take. Their reckoning as the sons of Ethlu exactly corresponds to the sons of Aditi. Now, do all the deities match up with one another? No, they don't. Or I very much doubt it. Some of them likely do match up very exactly. So anyway, you have something that's parallel to what we find in Vedic tradition. So besides these high gods, there are also beings that are called non-gods in the Celtic tradition. They're called ande. Seems to mean non-gods or under-gods. And it describes these gods in the Laurgavala with a high degree of confusion. And sometimes it says these were the real gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and sometimes it says these were the husbandsmen of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and that they were not the kings. Other sources say they were the kings. Nobody is clear about exactly what position that they held in relation to the kings of the Tuatha Dé, meaning Dagda, Lug, Nuada. But I think from our comparative analysis, we can say with some certainty that, in fact, the children of Danu are not the kings. They are, in fact, the Ande, the non-gods. This is, of course, why Lug has a story about killing them. He is a god of law, of justice, of order, and enforcing that order, not simply giving the laws to men, but enforcing those laws. So there is a kind of innate violence and fearfulness in this. And so he destroys them because they violate the law. And specifically, the story is told that they kill his father. And these three figures are identified consistently through our sources as being the children of Danu and being the gods of the Tuatha Dé Danann, they are often called. But this is where the confusion comes in, because it is likely that the children of Ethlu were not referred to as the Tuatha Dé Danann, meaning the children of Danu, because they are not the children of Danu, and in fact we see that their leader, or at least one of their kings, in fact kills the children of Danu. So they cannot be referred to as the tribe of Danu. As a matter of fact, this is a direct parallel to the Vedic sources, where there is also the children of Danu, and they are effectively the demons. They are the Ande, the non-gods, the under-gods. They are the obstructive forces. They are the chthonic forces. And so you have one group of deities associated with Aditi, or in our case, Ethlu, and another group associated with Danu. But, to make it more confusing in the Celtic version, these children of Danu are fathered by Taranis, who is also known as Turin, who is also known as Dulveth. Now, Taranis in Gaul is identified by later sources as being equivalent to Jupiter, but also to Dis Pater. And Dis Pater is a chthonic deity that's associated with death. Irish sources show that he is the father of a host of deities, but many of whom are dark, violent, and or are identified as Fomorians. Now, all the gods are violent to some extent, right? But the violence and the cruelty exhibited by Fomorians, or for instance the sons of Danu and Taranis, are cruel to a different level, and they are lawless. They violate the law, and they are also called the chief plunderers over every land, and that isn't meant as a glorious thing. Like in medieval Irish king praise poetry and such, Lug is sometimes invoked, and the poet will often say something like, "Oh, this king is glorious like Lug," because like Lug, he is either going to or has expelled the foreigners from the land. And the foreigners here are the Fomorians and those forces from the underworld that are encroaching on humanity. Another source tells us from the Dinchenahas that when Lug arrived, all the corrupted of the Tuatha fled. And so this is expressing the idea that the Fomorians or the Ande, originally they were part of one giant homogeneous group. And it was really the arrival of Lug that separated this group into two distinct factions, and that he's the one who drives them beneath. And although I'm sure it might be argued that Lug is perhaps in many ways similar to Varuna, in many ways also he takes on certain myths about Indra. And of course the slaying of the children of Danu is a significant one. Now, it will take too long to get into every individual deity in detail, but the list that was provided earlier actually sort of gives you a summary about the roles of these deities. An example of the complexity of how these deities were understood, Govnu in Gaul was sometimes interpreted as Mars, and we would look at him and say, well, why wasn't he interpreted as Vulcan or something? And I'm sure that he was often in many cases, but we do have inscriptural evidence that shows him equated with Mars in more than one example. And the final point that I'll make is that in some way these gods are all likely related to the sun in some fashion, some powers associated with the sun, and specific powers that are manifested in the world. So they, we want to think of them like, oh, is this a god of the sky? Is this a god of the fields? We're compartmentalizing our thinking a lot. But from my understanding, it doesn't seem like the Celtic gods are thought of in this way. Instead, they're thought of expressing fundamental powers in the universe, not simply restricted to a physical place in the world, although they might be more associated with that place depending on the powers that they represent. This way of understanding the gods seems to be a modern sort of invention, or it's that our minds have become so structured that we want to see the world in this way for some reason. Like, for instance, and people really want to restrict things, and they say, well, if Dagda was a god of storms, and, he could manifest storms and did, and if his Lork is the sort of thunder club, then that means Lug couldn't possibly be a lightning god, even though he is. So, or how if Lug is related to the sun and guides the sun, rises and sets the sun and travels through the night sky, why does he summon a storm and cast lightning bolts and have fire? Well, they are not so restricted, and they are not reducible to physical emanations, right? They're not reducible to anything in the environment. They're not reducible to a storm. They're not reducible to the sky even. They are beings that are ordering the cosmos. And ultimately, they are emanations of the one existence, the one eternal being. That's what I get from the source material. And when we look at comparative analysis to especially Vedic sources, that seems to be more or less the understanding. That there is a multiplicity of deities, but ultimately they refer to different expressions or different forms of being of one eternal essence. And I think it's because they had this belief that Christianity was able to spread as it did. But as we see from St. Patrick, the focus of the worship was upon the sun. The sun was seen to be the emanation, and in fact is the emanation of all the powers in the world, basically, for the most part. Most of the energy on Earth ultimately comes from the sun. Now, people have dismissed St. Patrick's claim that the Irish worship the sun for some reason. I'm not sure why. But people wanted to think that the Irish thinking of the gods was exactly identical to the Greek thinking. I think that's why they wanted to try to do it. They wanted to try to line it up with the Greek example. It simply doesn't work. And the reason why is because it lines up almost exactly with the Vedic example. So St. Patrick was very critical of sun worship in Ireland. And people took this to mean that there was one solar god, and this was the god of the Irish. This isn't how it worked. The gods mentioned are likely all related to the sun and various different solar-related powers. As we see, Lugh seems to be the same figure who rises and sets the sun, but also transits the sky at night, like Mercury or Hermes, to meet the sun in the morning again and call it up. He is identified by Christian sources as a warrior figure who had red legs as the sun was shining between his legs, which is exactly how a 13th century poem describes Lugh, that he possessed all the knowledge of the history of Ireland and how to set the laws and the division of the land, and that his knowledge helped establish Tara. He is identified as Trefolngid Trí Ocher, meaning the supporter of the three keys, or even the three doorways or gates. So he is a liminal figure that brings about the day and the night. And so, we can't make one-to-one comparisons of Irish deities to Vedic ones, but we can see that there is a similar conception going on, and that they thought about the world in a similar way. And because they conceived the world in a similar way, they conceived the gods in a similar way, although they understood each different function slightly differently. So certain functions were ascribed to one god that were not necessarily ascribed to the other. But nevertheless, the overall system seems very similar. So anyway, to sum up, it seems the primary gods were considered the sons of Ethlu, and they would be Nuada, Dagda, Govnu, Diancecht, Luchta, Credna, Lugh, and or Ogma. There were likewise the Ande, the non-gods, who were underworld deities, who likely also would have been appeased at certain times with offerings, but were probably not worshipped actively, although they could have been associated with certain festivals, and they might have been sacrificed to in some cases. For instance, we do see quite a number of different dedications to Tyrannus in Gaul, even though it seems that, at least to some people, he was considered to be a chthonic deity, and he is likely the exact equivalent of Sumanus from the Roman tradition, a type of chthonic Jupiter, an underworld type of Jupiter, a Jupiter of the dark sky, who is nonetheless worshipped at the summer solstice, or had a celebration where he was offered wheel cakes on the summer solstice. Finally, there's an interesting quote from the Laura Gavala that describes the gods as this: sons of the wood that does not wither. Elsewhere it is said that the true name of Ethlu is Feada, meaning wood. And Ethlu, the name itself, might mean little fire, but it might mean a kernel or a seed, so that all of the gods emerge from a cosmic seed, or a little fire, or wood that contains within it the power of fire. And the kingship of Ireland is described as being the kingship of fire. So to be the high king is to be in possession of the kingship of fire. If you found this interesting, I hope you'll consider checking out my Patreon and supporting me through there. I frequently update Patreon with various posts, additional content, and respond to questions and suggestions. I'd like to thank all my Patreon subscribers for their support. Gorav mi lamagat as eishtach agus marigoni shas go hard.